A flurry of 911 calls leads police to the scene of a shocking crime.
Someone just got shot in my apartment in the parking lot.
You said somebody got shot in the parking lot?
Yes.
There's a massive pool of blood below the victim's body.
He was shot at least 4 times. He was clearly not doing well.
Was this a random attack or a dispute between neighbors?
For something to escalate that fast in broad daylight, that's really shocking.
There were 4 flat tires on this car. They were slashed.
Or is there someone who knows more than they're willing to let on?
We have a witness that's covered in blood.
There's a high probability that she was probably involved in this.
So do you have any idea why we're here?
No, not really.
It was obvious that she knew more than what she was telling.
Soon, detectives are on the trail of a sordid love triangle filled with jealousy and violence.
The relationship was absolutely volatile.
She's professing her love to this guy. That creates a lot of heightened emotions.
For a split second, I didn't know what to do.
I mean, couldn't you just walk away? Why did you have to shoot? But I think in the end, rage played a large part.
September 11th, 2021. It's a balmy Saturday morning in Bradenton, Florida, a beachy Gulf Coast community halfway between Tampa and Sarasota.
It's just a slow, kind of laid-back town. There's a lot of places to go, especially out on the beaches. It's beautiful.
We've been known as the Friendly City since 1924.
But just before noon, a series of 911 calls pour in reporting a shooting at a nearby apartment complex.
There's been a shooting at the Silver 51st.
Okay, were you involved at all? Are you with the patient?
No, I'm standing right above town. I think the guy's dead. He's just laying there.
Is he breathing?
Yes, a very painful.
First responders race to the scene and immediately attempt to render aid to the victim.
The first officer on scene saw a man lying on a sidewalk, a pool of blood underneath him.
He was not conscious, and he was clearly not doing well.
There's multiple gunshot wounds to this victim's body.
He was shot at least 4 times, in his chest, in his back, the back of his legs.
As officers continue working on the victim, onlookers are able to identify him.
We actually had a witness that said that man who was shot, he's Cecil Richardson.
26-year-old Cecil Richardson was well known around his hometown as a gentle giant.
At well over 6 feet tall, Cecil had been a star football and basketball player in high school.
For the graduation, he was one of the keynote speakers. It was beautiful to see, and it just carried over from there.
After going to college out of state, Cecil eventually returned to Bradenton, where he decided to start his own business.
One of the businesses that he had was selling wigs. He had his eyes set on just being a big entrepreneur in his city.
For Cecil, the sky is the limit because he was entrepreneurial. He had the wherewithal to be able to start a business, to be able to maintain the business.
Everyone was kind of drawn to his energy. He'd have to connect his customers. He'd have to get them excited about the product. And Cecil was perfect for that.
Once he started to believe in himself, then it was no stopping him. He was very witty, very smart. Just his demeanor and his stature just commanded attention.
Which is part of what attracted 27-year-old single mother Chanel Lawson to him.
She was a mom of 2. Chanel and Cecil had a very on and off relationship, but they just couldn't seem to resist each other.
We've all been young, and we've had these relationships that are on and off. So they both probably played the game of trying to figure out their relationship.
But now Cecil has been found shot multiple times in an apartment parking lot.
He was unresponsive. He had what appeared to be 1 or 2 wounds there in his abdomen, a grazing wound on his arm, as well as a wound on his leg.
However, to everyone's surprise, Cecil still has a pulse.
The ambulance showed very quickly after that.
He was quickly transported to the hospital, and they were continuing those life-saving measures en route.
It's a race against the clock to save Cecil Richardson.
In Bradenton, Florida, 26-year-old Cecil Richardson had worked hard throughout his life, excelling in school and athletics, and building his own successful business.
He was doing what he had to do. He was doing great things.
But now, Cecil is being sped to the hospital in an ambulance after suffering multiple gunshot wounds.
It's a race against the clock to save Cecil Richardson.
Once at the hospital, doctors fight to keep him alive, but the damage is irreversible.
He was pronounced deceased at the hospital.
This changes everything. We now have a homicide.
Meanwhile, more investigators arrive to assess the crime scene.
We found 9mm casings at the scene, which led us to believe it was a 9mm gun.
It also appeared that there were bullet holes in the building. Our crime scene investigator removed 2 projectiles from that.
Investigators also take note of an SUV idling near where Cecil fell.
The idling vehicle is parked in such a way that it's blocking another vehicle, the silver sedan.
It appeared that some altercation happened near the car. He was shot or wounded in some way where his blood was deposited on the side of the car. Then, as he traveled around the back of the car, he deposited more blood. He then fell behind the car and during this time was shot multiple times.
There were 4 flat tires on this car, but they weren't just flat. They were slashed, so that's a pretty big sign that something happened here.
Someone was mad when they slashed those tires. They could be neighbors that were having a problem between them, and it escalated into a shooting. We really didn't know at that point.
For something to escalate that fast in broad daylight, that's really shocking.
After running the plates on the 2 vehicles, investigators learn the silver sedan is registered to a middle-aged man they aren't familiar with, but the idling SUV is registered to their victim, Cecil.
In searching the 2 vehicles, police locate a cell phone in the silver sedan.
And they also discover some interesting items in Cecil's car.
We did find he had about $400 in cash in the center console.
In the trunk of his car, they find an AR-15 assault rifle and 2 loaded magazines.
That firearm was encased in its own container, which appeared to be undisturbed.
Investigators don't believe this particular weapon played any part in the crime.
It's not that unusual for young men of his age to carry firearms. The fact that it was in the car didn't say as much to me as the fact that he did not remove it from the car.
If his gun is in the trunk of a car, he had no thought process to go there for a gunfight or to be in an incident. It's in his car, it's locked up.
Hoping to learn more about what happened, police shift their attention to residents of the apartment complex who have gathered in the parking lot.
Did any of you guys see or hear anything?
What we were able to gather from witnesses was that a male and female were sitting in the car with the 4 flat tires, smoking marijuana, and that another car pulled up, and Cecil exited the car, and there started to be some argument going on between the people in the car and Cecil that culminated in gunshots.
After the shots were fired, neighbors say the man and woman took off running and fled the scene in another nearby vehicle.
It was a white truck. They went out that way.
A pickup truck?
SUV.
Okay. 10-4. It's a white SUV, black male, black female, took off heading northbound through the parking lot.
Investigators work with apartment management to obtain surveillance footage that supports the neighbors' accounts.
The surveillance video was very important to us because it showed Cecil's vehicle pulling up to the scene and then ultimately going out of view. Then there was about a 50-second time lapse when you see these two individuals and this white SUV fleeing the scene quickly.
Unfortunately, though, the video was not clear enough to get a positive identification of the suspects or the license plate on the SUV.
However, in speaking with more neighbors, investigators get a lead on the female suspect.
According to neighbors, the silver sedan had recently been driven by a lady named Chanel Lawson. She was borrowing it from a friend.
Chanel Lawson actually lives in the apartment complex.
So, investigators head directly to her unit.
We go and we knock on the door, and nobody answered the door.
We could not just enter her apartment without a search warrant, and we didn't have enough probable cause for a search warrant at the time.
But something soon changes that.
They learn Chanel has children. So then detectives are wondering, if Chanel left the scene, who's watching her children?
Now we were concerned for the safety of the children. Were they involved in this incident? Were they shot? Were they injured? Therefore, we contacted the property manager of the complex and asked them to come with us to the door with the key and just make sure that no one was injured inside.
And once the door is opened, detectives are in for another surprise.
It turned out Chanel was actually there with the children.
She had blood on one of her fingers and blood on her leg.
Police in Bradenton, Florida, have just found shooting victim Cecil Richardson's on and off girlfriend, Chanel Lawson, with injuries of her own.
We noticed that she had blood on one of her fingers and there was blood on her leg. There's a high probability that she was probably involved in this.
Detectives were surprised that she was actually there because there's all this police activity literally outside of your building. You haven't bothered coming out. And not only that, but she's visibly bleeding. Something's just not right here. So that's when they asked, can we just interview you here in your apartment?
Chanel is reluctant, but agrees to tell them her story.
We're just trying to get to know you so that we can get into it. That's all, okay?
I know you're a little paranoid.
I'm very paranoid.
Are you paranoid for a special reason?
Of course I'm gonna be paranoid because I don't get into any trouble and I don't have no trouble. Then I have police knocking at my door or whatever. Of course I'm gonna be paranoid.
She's also cagey about the cause of her injury.
She was bleeding, but she didn't want to say how she hurt her finger.
What happened to your finger?
I don't know.
So, do you have any idea why we're here?
No, barely. Not really.
Something happened outside of your apartment today, and we'd like for you to tell us what you saw, what happened, and what was said.
Chanel acknowledges that she and Cecil have a romantic history. She also tells police he's the father of her youngest child.
The fact that Cecil and Chanel had a baby in common factored into the investigation because obviously it's very common to have issues with your ex-significant other or your co-parent. So obviously there was some kind of tension there.
Regardless, Chanel appears to be heartbroken when investigators tell her Cecil is dead.
He's not here anymore. He's gone. I'm sorry. Again, we're not here to get you in trouble. We're here to find the person that did this.
Chanel admits that her relationship with Cecil has been volatile for a long time.
My thing is, he's been such a problem. My baby daddy. Like, he's been such a problem in my years.
We know. But we also know that you do still kind of care for him. Care about what's happened to him, right?
That's when Chanel begins to open up about what happened earlier that morning.
Chanel said that she woke up, went downstairs, and she saw her tires on her vehicle flat. She stated that she assumed it was Cecil that flattened her tires.
How long has the tires been flat on?
I just woke up and it was like that.
So Chanel posts on Facebook ranting upset about her tires being slashed and how she works hard for her things and that sort of thing.
She was implying that Cecil slashed her tires.
He responded when you posted that on Facebook?
He just got upset about it. He's not gonna say that he did it. And he did not say that he did it. But who else could have done it?
Chanel says she called a tow truck to take her car to a mechanic, then went downstairs to wait.
They was taking a whole long time. They took over an hour to come. And I was just waiting outside my car.
Chanel explains that while she was waiting, a male friend of hers came by, and they decided to continue waiting inside her car.
She says she had some weed in the car, so they decided to smoke to pass the time.
But when detectives ask Chanel for her friend's name, she becomes cagey yet again.
Who was the guy that was out there with you?
Embarrassed to say somebody I met and I just had that around.
Well, this other guy, how do we get his information so that we can talk to him?
Honestly, I don't know.
What is this guy's name that you were with? But what is his nickname?
I call him John. I don't know what anybody else calls him.
It was very obvious that she really didn't want to, identify the other person.
However, Chanel eventually admits that her friend goes by the nickname Slick.
Chanel did give us the name Slick, but didn't want to expand on what his actual name would be.
According to Chanel, while she and Slick were smoking, Cecil showed up to confront her about the social media posts she'd made.
The only thing I remember is him pulling up and we was getting into a fight.
They're downstairs arguing about the slashed tires.
Is that how you hurt your finger?
I guess. I don't know.
She tells police that Cecil knocks her out cold. And when she wakes up, Cecil is shot and on the ground.
What did the other guy do that was with you? Where was he?
Honestly, when it happened, I don't know when he came. He was just sitting in my car, and that's really all I know.
But for investigators, Chanel's story just isn't adding up.
She knew every other detail leading up to this incident or confrontation, but happens to black out when the murder happens. To me, that was a red flag because there was something that she was hiding and she was holding back on.
Sensing their skepticism, Chanel begins to contradict herself, suggesting that Slick might have shot Cecil on her behalf.
Honestly, he did what he did to protect me.
She did admit to leaving the scene, and she did say that she drove this guy.
And we just left, and that was that.
Where did you drop him off?
But when detectives ask for details about the white SUV that served as the getaway car, Chanel goes back to giving vague answers.
Tell us where the car is. Tell us who owns the car. Let's start with that. Who owns the car?
I don't know what to say.
However, she is willing to tell them where the SUV is now.
She left the vehicle in a parking lot with the keys inside, and she walked back to the apartment complex.
Where is it? Where did you park it?
Over there, across the street.
It was obvious that she knew more than what she was telling about the murder.
She was giving us the runaround. She had something to hide, and that's why she eventually ended up being arrested for accessory.
After transporting Chanel to the Manatee County Jail for booking, she's questioned again, but she remains tight-lipped.
I already told her everything, so I just don't care to say anything else. It is what it is.
Okay, I mean, you don't have to. That's your choice.
With Chanel refusing to say more, detectives obtain a search warrant for her cell phone.
Cell phone forensics are invaluable with these types of cases.
People run their mouths. They send messages, text, phone calls. Cell phones are a detective's gold mine to put a case together.
They happen upon this number. It's not been saved, there's no name, but they start reading the messages.
The messages seem to suggest that Chanel might be more than just friends with this individual.
Chanel's in these texts kind of professing her love to this guy.
That kind of gives us a clue, like, okay, she's close to this person. It's not Cecil. This is possibly the guy that she's with.
She was texting, I love you, Shamar. And he had responded, I love you, Chanel.
Could Shamar be Cecil's killer?
They head to social media. They start looking through Facebook, and what do they find? They find one account attached to Shamar.
And his profile name really piques detectives' interest.
Shamar's Facebook name was Slick Johnson.
Detectives in Bradenton, Florida, believe they have identified the man behind the fatal shooting of 26-year-old Cecil Richardson.
They identified a 22-year-old man named Shamar, who seems to be romantically linked to Cecil's ex, Chanel.
Shamar's Facebook name was Slick Johnson.
Chanel did give us the name Slick initially, but didn't want to expand on what his actual name would be.
When investigators do a deeper dive on Shamar Slick Johnson, they learn he's had several other run-ins with police over the years.
Shamar was definitely known to the police and had been arrested several times for drug-related charges.
Shamar had previously served time for selling fentanyl as well as evading police.
But where is Shamar now?
They're trying to track his phone, and they quickly realized that the phone had been turned off.
Our prime suspect was gone, and we couldn't find him.
He's not here now, and he's nowhere to be found. Shamar's on the run.
As law enforcement scours the area for Shamar, detectives continue their investigation by speaking with Cecil's inner circle.
And speaking with Cecil's friends, they started to piece together more of a motive.
According to friends, there was a big feud among the trio over whether Cecil or Shamar was the father of Chanel's youngest child.
Chanel was just playing both of them at the same time. These guys were literally taking turns sleeping over Chanel's house, claiming to be this baby's dad.
For a while, Chanel wasn't sure who had fathered the child. She thought maybe it was Shamar. Was it Shamar? Was it Cecil?
There was this thing about they didn't know who was really the father. Shamar had signed the birth certificate, but Cecil took a paternity test that identified him as being the dad.
Shamar probably developed a connection with the child just like Cecil did. So there's obviously that friction.
Cecil's friend says the friction between the two men never went away.
He told us Shamar was somebody he did not want to be messed up with. He was able to provide information about Shamar pulling a gun on Cecil at a party. After that gun situation, there's a potential for violence.
That creates a volatile situation, and sometimes it bubbles over, which is what I think happened here.
And as detectives continue to investigate, they also find evidence that Chanel is capable of violence.
2 years before Cecil's death in 2019, there was a police report at an apartment because 2 individuals were fighting. They get there and Chanel has been kicking and punching on Cecil, and she even takes her car and rams it into Cecil's car.
To detectives, it's clear that tensions have been heating up for a while. But did it reach a boiling point 6 weeks ago, leading Shamar to take Cecil's life? In order to find out, detectives need to track down Shamar.
It frustrated me to have somebody on the run for that long. It's crazy. It's crazy to me. There has to be some level of worry going on within the community. If he was still at large, then would he be armed and dangerous?
It's very frustrating when a suspect is on the run because you want to talk to them, you want to get their side of the story, but you have limited resources.
But on October 22nd, there's an unexpected breakthrough in the case.
Even though Shamar is smart enough to elude police for 6 weeks, you know what he does? He goes back to Chanel's house.
He went back to the same location that all of this happened.
After 6 weeks of searching for 22-year-old murder suspect Shamar Slick Johnson, Florida investigators have just learned he's returned to the scene of the crime.
Shamar was a ladies' man, and it turns out that one of the girls that he was with knew he was going back to Chanel, and she ultimately assisted us in locating him.
At this point, Chanel was out of jail and back home.
I don't remember if the judge just allowed her to get out on a smaller bond or what, but yeah, she was out.
There's a peaceful arrest. Shamar goes to the police without any ruckus.
I cannot believe that he went back to the same location that all of this happened, knowing that he was being searched for.
I would have been out of the state. If I had gone that long, it just makes no sense to me. That makes no sense at all. Maybe he just didn't care and wasn't concerned about being caught or something of that nature. But that's how he got apprehended, so I'm grateful that he did.
Considering how long Shamar eluded police, detectives are surprised by his cooperation when they get him in an interrogation room.
No, I ain't gonna have to, but you got my word.
All right. You got my word for sure, bro.
Shamar is actually a people person. He doesn't come off as someone that will commit violent crimes. One of the first things he said to us, which made us both feel good about this interview and how it was gonna go, was, "I trust you guys."
So where do y'all want to start from?
What you feel comfortable with, man?
Tell your story.
Like how everything started.
According to Shamar, he had no intention of killing Cecil in the apartment parking lot on September 11th.
Shamar says that he and Chanel were sitting in the car, they're smoking weed.
I'm about to roll up and smoke, and she say, "Oh my God." So when she say that, I look, and it's him. He pull up, but how he pull up is like he blocked the car off.
According to Shamar, Cecil was looking for a fight because Chanel had accused him of slashing her tires.
She made a Facebook status. It didn't say no names or nothing. It was just like, I worked hard for my stuff. So then that's when the victim, he like texting her, was like, "Oh, why you making Facebook statuses about me?" And I'm telling him like, "Man, don't even text him back," because he's just mad. Don't text him back.
Shamar tells detectives that Cecil approached Chanel's window, demanding his belongings that were still in her apartment.
He was telling her, "Get my stuff out of the apartment." And according to Shamar, she was saying no, and Shamar was even saying to her, "Get the man's stuff," and she still was refusing to go get it.
He was like, "Hey man, go up there and get my..." So I look at her like, "Man, go get the man's stuff," because I'm trying to be the mediator in this situation.
Then Shamar said that Chanel got out of the car and Cecil started tussling with her to try and get the keys to the apartment so he could go up and get his things.
I don't know what he was doing, trying to get the keys from her or what. So even then, I'm still sitting in the car.
He says that there's a confrontation where Cecil grabs Chanel.
I don't know what happened. He had her pinned up to the car. Like, for a split second, I didn't know what to do. He just kept fighting her, and when this situation happened, it was like fear, bro. It was a fear, adrenaline thing.
But Shamar says as the altercation continued, something unexpected happened.
While Chanel and Cecil were tussling, a gun fell to the ground.
When I picked the gun up, I didn't cock it or nothing. I just closed my eyes and started shooting.
Shamar Johnson, the prime suspect in the murder of 26-year-old Cecil Richardson, is finally giving a statement to investigators.
He says while Chanel and Cecil were tussling, a gun fell to the ground. And when you ask him where the gun came from, he really had no explanation.
Who had the gun?
I guess he had it. I don't know. During the tussling, the gun dropped. I picked it up.
He was able to pick the gun up, and he shot Cecil.
He was trying to fight me, and when I picked the gun up, I didn't cock it or nothing. I just closed my eyes and started shooting.
He explains Cecil was a bigger guy, and he said that he was afraid, and he shot him in self-defense.
Shamar says that as soon as Chanel realized what happened, she jumped into action.
She was like, oh my gosh, what did you do? And I was just like, I don't know, like. So then she was like, I gotta get you out here.
After fleeing the scene in the white SUV, Shamar says Chanel dropped him off on Cortez and 9th Street, and from there, he walked to a family member's home.
I got rid of my phone, like, I say about a day or a couple days after it happened. Because at first I just turned it off, and then like they was like, oh, they can track you from your phone or whatever, so I just got rid of it and got another phone.
That phone, what'd you do with that phone?
I threw it on the side of the road in Orlando, so.
Orlando?
My brother took me to Orlando.
I don't think he was in Orlando for long when he fled. I think he came right back, and he was just hopping around where he could. We were getting tips, that he bought a new cell phone, and we got tips that he was talking to this girl.
But while Shamar's story seems plausible on the surface, detectives remain skeptical.
So you said you wanted to come in and tell your side,
but then you were afraid. I wanted to because like when I finally made my mind up to come in, I'm all over the news for a second-degree murder.
Generally speaking, innocent people do not flee the scene. When someone flees, it tells us right away something's wrong.
There's a lot of things that he said that just didn't make sense. I didn't believe that there was a physical confrontation just because of how Cecil's body was found.
The gun just ain't dropping from nowhere, and you all of a sudden pick it up. You had to either pull that from somewhere, you had it on you. So based on that information, we knew that was a half story.
The detectives were asking him certain questions like, couldn't you have just left? I mean, couldn't you just walk away? Why did you have to shoot?
When they were going at it, do you feel like you could have gotten out of the car and ran off and called for help? Or backed off and kind of looked back at it?
I did think about it, though. When he first pulled up, I was like, man, I'm finna get up out of here.
He was very adamant on the protection thing. I was protecting her. But he didn't realize that there were other ways he could have protected her without having to kill someone.
I can tell you really care about the girl. I know you do. You really care about that baby. And you just was trying to do your best to be there for her and the child.
I just wish I could have did something different. But even after it happened, as I try to think, like, I wasn't really left with too many options. Like,
honestly, I feel like you were. I feel like you had options. I feel like you could have got out of there.
At the end of the interview, Shamar is still claiming self-defense, but detectives believe he's lying to save his own skin.
In Shamar's mind, he felt if I can create this environment that I was in fear of my life, I can get away with this.
Instead, police charge Shamar with second-degree murder.
So will I have a bond or anything like that?
That's up to the judge.
Like, do y'all know if I can be home on an ankle monitor or anything like that?
I doubt they're gonna give you an ankle monitor for a murder charge. They charge him with second-degree murder because in order for first degree, you have to prove planned, premeditated murder. Given the circumstance of second-degree murder, all you have to prove is that their actions caused the death of someone during whatever it be, argument, dispute, or robbery, so on and so forth.
When Shamar's trial begins in November 2023, he maintains his claim of self-defense. But prosecutors argue that it was jealousy between Shamar and Cecil that motivated the shooting.
I think Chanel was seeing each of them without the other's knowledge, and that creates a lot of heightened emotions, and sometimes those emotions can bubble over and cause a situation just like this.
It's like a competition, and knowing that, hey, Chanel was just dealing with both of us at the same time, I think that can bring about some animosity between both guys.
According to prosecutors, by the day of the shooting, the bad blood between Cecil and Shamar had reached a boiling point.
Not only was Chanel in the middle of this love triangle between Cecil and Shamar, she had made it even more complicated. She had a baby, and there was a birth certificate. She placed Shamar's name as the father on the birth certificate, yet Cecil was the father. These two men had definite beef with each other.
Prosecutors argue that when Chanel thought Cecil was behind the slashing of her tires, Shamar lost it.
I think rage played a large part. I think there was the underlying jealousy and the underlying heightened emotions, but I think in the end, when Shamar lost control, it was probably due to just rage.
In fact, investigators could never confirm if Cecil was the one who slashed Chanel's tires. It could have been anyone.
When the jury retires to deliberate, prosecutors feel confident that they've made a strong argument for Shamar's guilt. But will the jury agree?
You never know what your jury's gonna do. Even if you think you should win the case, even if you think it's obvious, you could still have one juror or two jurors that come up with something you didn't even think of. So it's always a gamble.
However, in this case, the gamble pays off.
The jury deliberated for somewhere between 2 and 3 hours and ultimately found that Shamar Johnson was guilty of second-degree murder.
And he was sentenced to 40 years in prison.
I think 40 years is very light for a homicide, but the family agreed with it. They were happy with that, and that's what really matters.
As for Chanel, she ends up taking a plea deal for her involvement in the crime and gets a much lighter sentence.
The case against Chanel, we could show that she did aid this person, but she didn't pull the trigger. So we knew that her sentence was going to be much less than his. She was sentenced to 34 months in prison.
I'm very upset that her part in it didn't carry a lengthier sentence. It's ridiculous is what it is. So like any day, she gonna be out and free and he can never come back. That's very frustrating.
At the end of the day, a love triangle filled with jealousy spiraled out of control, taking a kind-hearted entrepreneur out of the world forever.
This was all so unnecessary. It didn't have to happen. There is a child whose father is now dead and whose mother is in prison.
Life is forever different because he's not here. We can't bring him back. I wish that this was like a dream, but it's not. It's a real sad reality. We'll never be the same because of this, because somebody decided to take his life. It leaves a big hole and nothing is ever the same.
There are some photographs that seem to contain an entire story inside them. One of the most disturbing images connected to the Patty Hearst case is not a photograph of a kidnapping, a prison cell, or a police interrogation. It is an image of a young woman standing beside members of a radical revolutionary organization, holding a rifle during a bank robbery. The woman is 19 years old. Her name is Patricia Campbell Hearst, known to the public as Patty Hearst. Only a short time earlier, she had been a university student living in Berkeley, California, and a member of one of the most prominent and wealthy families in America. She had not chosen to become famous. She had not chosen to become the subject of a nationwide manhunt. And, according to her later account, she had certainly not chosen to be taken from her home by armed strangers. Yet on April 15, 1974, cameras inside a San Francisco bank captured an image that appeared to tell a completely different story. Patty Hearst was there with members of the Symbionese Liberation Army, or SLA, the same organization that had kidnapped her only weeks earlier. She was carrying a rifle and assisting during the robbery. For the American public, the contradiction was almost impossible to understand. How could a kidnapping victim become involved in a bank robbery with her own captors? Was Patty Hearst a frightened young woman doing whatever she had to do to survive? Had she been psychologically manipulated into accepting the identity forced upon her? Or had she, at some point, genuinely chosen to join the organization that had taken her? Those questions would follow her for decades. They would become the central issue of her trial and would turn a kidnapping into something much more complicated than a simple story of victim and perpetrator. To understand why that image was so shocking, it is necessary to go back to the beginning, before Patty Hearst became Tanya, before the FBI began one of the most extensive searches associated with the case, and before the young woman at the center of the story was forced into a role she could never have anticipated. In 1974, Patty Hearst was 19 years old. She had been born into the Hearst family, a name closely associated with American newspapers, wealth, and influence. She was the granddaughter of William Randolph Hearst, the powerful newspaper publisher whose legacy had made the Hearst family one of the most recognizable media families in the United States. Patty was living in Berkeley, California, and was a student. Nothing about her public life suggested that she was preparing to become part of a violent, revolutionary movement. She belonged to a world that seemed almost completely separate from the small underground organization that would soon make her its most famous captive. That organization called itself the Symbionese Liberation Army. The SLA was a radical revolutionary group that advocated armed struggle against the United States government and the capitalist system. It was a small organization, but its ambitions were much larger than its numbers. Its members came from different racial and social backgrounds, and the group attempted to present itself as a revolutionary army. One of its most prominent leaders was Donald DeFreeze, who used the name Sink. Before the kidnapping of Patty Hearst, the SLA had already carried out violent acts intended to establish its reputation. Among them was an attack in Oakland involving 2 school officials and ammunition containing cyanide. One of the officials died, while another was injured. The SLA wanted to be seen not as an ordinary criminal gang, but as an organization engaged in revolutionary warfare. Yet there was a problem. Very few people in America knew who the SLA was. A small underground movement could claim to be fighting a revolution, but without public attention, its message could disappear almost completely. The organization needed an action large enough to force the country to notice it. The kidnapping of Patty Hearst offered precisely that opportunity. She was young. She was from a wealthy and famous family. Her disappearance would immediately attract attention, and the name of her family guaranteed that newspapers and television networks would have a reason to keep reporting the story. On the evening of February 4th, 1974, Patty Hearst was at her apartment at 2603 Benvenue Street in Berkeley. She was in apartment number 4 with her fiancé, Stephen Weed. It was around 9 o'clock at night when the ordinary rhythm of the evening was broken by a knock at the door. What happened next would change the course of Patty's life. Armed kidnappers entered the apartment. Stephen Weed was beaten. Patty was restrained and taken away. According to the FBI account, she was placed in the trunk of a vehicle and driven away. Within moments, she had gone from being a 19-year-old student living an ordinary life to becoming the central figure in a kidnapping that would dominate national news. But this was not simply a conventional kidnapping in which criminals demanded money and disappeared. The SLA had a political purpose. The organization wanted the Hearst family to use its wealth to distribute a massive amount of food to poor people. The demand was designed to transform the kidnapping into a public demonstration. Patty Hearst was not merely being held for ransom. She was being used as leverage against one of the most prominent families in America. Her disappearance quickly became national news. The name Patty Hearst appeared across newspapers and television broadcasts. The name Symbionese Liberation Army, previously known to relatively few Americans, was suddenly being discussed across the country. The kidnapping had achieved what the SLA wanted: attention. At the same time, the FBI began a major investigation. The case was given the code name Hernap, and investigators began trying to determine where Patty was being held and who was responsible for taking her. For her family, however, the investigation was not an abstract federal operation. Their daughter was missing. They did not know where she was or what was happening to her. The public knew even less. Then, as the investigation continued, the story took an unexpected turn. Messages began to emerge from the SLA. Patty Hearst was alive. That fact alone should have been a relief. But what she said in those recordings created an entirely different kind of shock. Patty began to claim that she had taken the side of the people who had kidnapped her. She adopted a new name, Tanya. On April 3, 1974, the SLA released a recording in which Patty stated that she had joined the organization. For the Hearst family, the meaning of those words was difficult to comprehend. Their daughter had been abducted at gunpoint. Now, according to her own recorded statements, she appeared to be rejecting the identity she had possessed before the kidnapping and accepting another one. The question was no longer simply where Patty Hearst was. The question was what had happened to her while she was gone. Patty would later say that she had been abused, threatened, and psychologically manipulated during her captivity. The prosecution would eventually argue that she had made choices and voluntarily participated in the activities of the SLA. Between those two interpretations lay the central mystery of the entire case. A person can be physically kidnapped and still be capable of making choices. But a person can also be subjected to fear, isolation, threats, and psychological pressure in ways that outsiders may never fully understand. The case would later become associated with the idea commonly known as Stockholm Syndrome, although the circumstances surrounding Patty Hearst were far more complicated than a simple label could explain. And before a courtroom would ever be asked to decide how much responsibility Patty should bear, the country would witness something even more difficult to understand. On April 15, 1974, cameras inside a San Francisco bank captured Patty Hearst again. This time, she was not appearing in a recording to tell her family that she was alive. She was physically present during a bank robbery. She was carrying a rifle alongside members of the SLA. The young woman who had been introduced to America as a kidnapped heiress was now visible in the role of an armed participant in a criminal act. That image transformed the case. It blurred the boundary between victim and suspect, between coercion and choice, between survival and participation. The FBI now had to search not only for the people who had kidnapped Patty Hearst, but also for Patty herself. And for the public, one question became impossible to avoid: if someone is taken against her will, but later appears to act alongside her captors, where exactly does the victim end and the accomplice begin? The answer would not come quickly. It would take a 19-month manhunt, a violent confrontation in Los Angeles, a highly publicized trial, and decades of debate before the legal story finally reached its conclusion. But everything began with a 19-year-old woman, a knock at an apartment door, and a kidnapping that was never meant to remain a simple kidnapping. Before Patty Hearst became the woman the entire country would recognize from a bank surveillance image. She was simply a 19-year-old student living in Berkeley, California, surrounded by a family name that carried enormous weight in American society. Patricia Campbell Hearst had been born in 1954 and was the granddaughter of William Randolph Hearst, the powerful newspaper publisher whose influence had helped make the Hearst name synonymous with wealth, media, and public prominence. By 1974, Patty was 19 years old, a student, and living a life that appeared to belong to a completely different world from the underground revolutionary organization that would eventually abduct her. Her family background mattered because the Hearst name was not an anonymous one. It was recognizable, wealthy, and influential, and that visibility would later make Patty an especially valuable target for a group that desperately wanted attention. But at this point, before the kidnapping, there was no reason for an ordinary 19-year-old student to imagine that her family name could make her the center of a national political drama. The organization that would change that was the Symbionese Liberation Army, usually known by its initials, SLA. The SLA was a radical revolutionary group that advocated armed struggle against the United States government and the capitalist system. It was a relatively small organization, but its ambitions were much greater than its size. Its members came from different racial and social backgrounds, and they presented themselves as revolutionaries engaged in a struggle against the existing political and economic order. Among its most prominent leaders was Donald DeFreeze, who used the name Sync. The organization did not see itself as a conventional criminal group. It wanted to be understood as a revolutionary movement, one prepared to use violence in pursuit of its political goals. That distinction was important to the SLA because its identity depended on being recognized. A revolutionary organization could not easily build influence if the public did not know it existed. The SLA therefore needed actions that would attract attention, create fear, and force the media to repeat its name. Before Patty Hearst entered the story, the organization had already carried out violent acts. One of the most serious incidents occurred in Oakland, where SLA members attacked two school officials using ammunition containing cyanide. One of those officials died, while the other was injured. The attack demonstrated the willingness of the group to use lethal violence and reinforce the image it wanted to create for itself. The SLA wanted to appear dangerous, organized, and committed to an armed revolutionary struggle. Yet there remained a fundamental problem. The organization was still relatively unknown to the wider American public. The name Symbionese Liberation Army meant little to most people. For a small underground movement seeking national recognition, that lack of visibility was a major obstacle. The group needed something dramatic enough to push its name into newspapers and television broadcasts across the country. The kidnapping of Patty Hearst would provide that opportunity. Her family background made her different from an ordinary potential victim. She was young, connected to one of America's most prominent media families, and therefore almost certain to attract enormous public attention if she disappeared. The SLA could exploit the family's wealth and public reputation while simultaneously turning the kidnapping into a political spectacle. On the evening of February 4th, 1974, that plan became reality. Patty was at her apartment at 2603 Benvenue Street in Berkeley, apartment number 4. She was with her fiancé, Stephen Weed. At approximately 9 o'clock that evening, someone knocked on the door. What followed was sudden and violent. Armed kidnappers entered the apartment. Stephen Weed was beaten, and Patty was taken by force. According to the FBI account, she was placed in the trunk of a vehicle and driven away. In a matter of moments, her previous life had been interrupted completely. The 19-year-old student was no longer simply a member of a famous family. She was now a captive, and her disappearance would soon become the vehicle through which the SLA attempted to introduce itself to America. The kidnapping itself was only the beginning. The organization did not simply demand money in exchange for Patty's release. Instead, the SLA used the power of the Hearst name to make a political and social demand. The family was ordered to distribute a massive quantity of food to poor people. The demand was designed to place the Hearst family in an impossible public position while giving the SLA a platform. The organization wanted the country to watch. It wanted the wealthy Hearst family to be forced into a highly visible response. And most importantly, it wanted the media to repeat the name Symbionese Liberation Army. The strategy worked. Patty's disappearance quickly became national news. Her photograph and name were circulated widely, while the previously obscure organization responsible for her kidnapping suddenly became the subject of national attention. The story had everything that could dominate public interest: a young woman, a famous family, armed radicals, political demands, and an unanswered question about whether the hostage was still alive. For the Hearst family, however, the publicity could not make the situation less frightening. Their daughter was missing, and the people holding her had demonstrated that they were willing to use violence. The federal investigation began to expand. The FBI opened a major investigation into the kidnapping, assigning the case the code name Hernap. Investigators had to determine who had taken Patty, where she was being held, and what the SLA intended to do next. The investigation was complicated by the nature of the organization itself. The SLA was small and underground. Its members could use different identities and hide from authorities, while people connected to the group could potentially provide information about its activities. At the same time, the organization was communicating with the outside world through its own messages, turning the kidnapping into a continuing public campaign. The investigators were therefore not simply searching for an ordinary kidnapper who wanted to remain invisible. They were dealing with a group that wanted its actions to be seen and discussed, even while its members themselves remained difficult to locate. Then the case took a turn that nobody could easily explain. Messages from the SLA indicated that Patty was alive. For her family, confirmation that she had survived the kidnapping should have been reassuring. Instead, what Patty said in those communications created a new and deeply disturbing question. She began to say that she had taken the side of the SLA. She adopted the name Tanya. On April 3, 1974, the organization released a recording in which Patty stated that she had joined the group. The meaning of that declaration was immediately difficult to understand. She had been taken from her home against her will. Yet now her own voice appeared to say that she had chosen to align herself with the people who had taken her. The contradiction would become the defining feature of the case. Patty later said that during her captivity, she had been abused, threatened, and psychologically manipulated. Her account would become central to the defense presented at her eventual trial. But at this stage, the public had only fragments: a kidnapping, the demands of the SLA, recordings in which Patty called herself Tanya, and the growing possibility that the young woman might no longer be acting simply as a hostage. The situation also introduced a difficult psychological question. How should outsiders interpret the behavior of someone held captive by an extremist organization? The case would eventually be discussed in connection with the idea commonly called Stockholm Syndrome, but that label could never fully capture the complexity of Patty's circumstances. A kidnapping does not automatically erase a person's ability to make decisions, just as participation in a crime does not automatically prove that every decision was made freely. The distance between those two realities would become the central tension of Patty's story. Meanwhile, the SLA had achieved exactly what it had wanted from the kidnapping. The organization was no longer obscure. Its name was known across America. Its political demands had been broadcast through the media. Patty Hearst had become a national symbol. But the organization was about to take the case into territory that would make the question of Patty's role almost impossible to avoid. On April 15th, only a short time after the recording in which she called herself Tanya, Patty would appear again. This time, there would be no question about whether the public had heard her correctly. Security cameras inside a San Francisco bank would record her presence during a robbery. She would be carrying a rifle alongside members of the SLA. In that moment, the story of a kidnapped 19-year-old would become something far more complicated. The woman America had been searching for was no longer merely missing. She appeared to be participating, and from that point forward, the investigation would have to confront a question that had no simple answer. Whether Patty Hearst was still a victim of the SLA, had become a willing member of it, or occupied some deeply complicated position somewhere between those two possibilities. On the evening of February 4, 1974, Patty Hearst was still living the life of a 19-year-old student in Berkeley, California. Nothing about that evening, at least from the information available in the case, suggested that she was about to become the center of one of the most controversial kidnapping stories in American history. She was at apartment number 4 at 2603 Benvenue Street, where she was with her fiancé, Stephen Weed. It was an ordinary setting for a young woman whose family name was anything but ordinary. Patty was the granddaughter of William Randolph Hearst, and the Hearst family was one of the most prominent and wealthy media families in the United States. Yet the significance of that name would become clear only after the violence began. At approximately 9 o'clock that night, there was a knock at the apartment door. The moment appears simple when reduced to a single sentence, but it marked the boundary between two completely different parts of Patty's life. When the door was opened, armed kidnappers entered the apartment. Stephen Weed was beaten. Patty was restrained and taken away. According to the FBI account of the case, she was placed in the trunk of a vehicle and driven away. There was no gradual transition, no warning that could prepare her for what was happening, and no opportunity for her to understand what the people entering the apartment intended to do. In the space of a short period of time, a 19-year-old student had become a hostage. The significance of the kidnapping became even greater because of who Patty was and who her captors represented. The people who took her were members of the Symbionese Liberation Army, or SLA, a radical revolutionary organization that advocated armed struggle against the United States government and the capitalist system. The SLA was not simply interested in disappearing with a wealthy victim and demanding a private ransom. The organization had a political purpose. Patty Hearst's family name gave the group something more valuable than money alone: attention. The Hearst family was wealthy, prominent, and widely recognized. A kidnapping involving a member of that family would almost inevitably become national news. For the SLA, that publicity could serve as a weapon. Before Patty's kidnapping, the group had already committed violent acts in an effort to establish its reputation. One of the most serious incidents involved an attack in Oakland against two school officials using ammunition containing cyanide. One person died, while another was injured. The SLA wanted to present itself as a revolutionary force prepared to use violence against the existing political and economic order. But it remained a relatively small and obscure organization. Most Americans had never heard of it. That was one of the central problems the kidnapping could solve. The disappearance of Patty Hearst guaranteed attention. Within a short time, the story moved beyond Berkeley and into the national media. Newspapers and television outlets began reporting that a young woman from the Hearst family had been abducted. The public wanted to know who had taken her, why she had been targeted, and whether she was alive. Those questions became more urgent because the SLA soon demonstrated that the kidnapping was part of a larger campaign. The organization began communicating with the Hearst family and the media. Instead of simply demanding a financial ransom, the SLA demanded that the Hearst family distribute a massive amount of food to poor people. The demand placed the family in an extraordinary position. Their daughter's freedom had been tied to a political and social message created by the people holding her. The ransom was not simply money. It was publicity, redistribution, and ideological confrontation. The SLA could present the wealthy Hearst family as a symbol of the system it opposed, while simultaneously forcing that family to respond publicly. Every report about the demand repeated the name of the organization responsible for the kidnapping. Every update about Patty Hearst kept the story alive. The strategy had succeeded in one crucial respect. The SLA was no longer unknown. The name was now being discussed across the country. But for the Hearst family, the publicity offered little comfort. Their daughter remained in the hands of armed extremists. They did not know where she was. They could not see her. They could not control what her captors might do. And the longer she remained missing, the more uncertainty surrounded her condition. The FBI responded with a major investigation. The case received the code Name Her Nap. Investigators began working to identify the kidnappers, locate Patty, and understand the structure of the SLA. The search was complicated because the organization operated underground and its members could use different identities and safe locations. At the same time, the SLA was deliberately communicating with the outside world. It wanted attention, but did not want to surrender control of its members. This created a strange dynamic in which the kidnappers were simultaneously hiding and publicizing themselves. The FBI had to follow whatever fragments of information became available while trying to determine which information could be trusted. The central objective remained simple: find Patty Hearst and bring her home. Then came the first indication that the story might not follow the expected pattern. Messages began to emerge from the SLA confirming that Patty was alive. For the family, that should have been the most important news since the kidnapping. Their daughter had survived, but the content of the messages transformed relief into confusion. Patty was not simply describing herself as a captive waiting to be rescued. She began to claim that she had taken the side of the organization holding her. She adopted a new name, Tanya. On April 3, 1974, the SLA released a recording in which Patty stated that she had joined the organization. The declaration created a profound contradiction. Only weeks earlier, she had been taken from her apartment by force. Now she appeared to be identifying herself with the people who had abducted her. For the public, it was almost impossible to interpret the situation from the outside. The voice belonged to Patty. The words appeared to come from Patty. But she was speaking while under the control of an organization that had kidnapped her. Was she freely expressing her own beliefs? Was she attempting to protect herself? Was she under psychological pressure? Or had her understanding of the situation genuinely changed during captivity? These questions would eventually become central to her defense. But at this stage, there were no simple answers. Patty later stated that she had been abused, threatened, and psychologically manipulated during her captivity. Her account would become a crucial part of the argument that she had not acted freely. The prosecution would later present a very different interpretation, arguing that Patty had made choices and participated willingly in the activities of the SLA. The distance between those two interpretations is where much of the enduring controversy surrounding the case lies. It is tempting, years later, to reduce the story to a simple transformation. A kidnapped girl becomes a revolutionary. But the available facts do not justify such a simple explanation. Patty had been physically taken from her home. She was held by an extremist group. She later appeared in its communications using a new identity and claiming allegiance to it. Those facts can exist simultaneously without automatically answering the question of why she behaved as she did. The term Stockholm Syndrome would eventually be associated with discussions of Patty Hearst. But even that concept does not provide a complete explanation of her experience. Her case involved captivity, fear, political ideology, psychological pressure, and eventually criminal conduct. Each element would have to be considered separately. For the FBI, however, the immediate problem was practical rather than philosophical. Patty was still missing. The investigators needed to find her. And now, they had an additional complication: the possibility that she was no longer merely being held by the SLA, but might be moving with its members and participating in their activities. That possibility became reality on April 15, 1974. Less than 3 months after her kidnapping, Patty Hearst appeared on security footage from a San Francisco bank. She was with members of the SLA during a robbery and was carrying a rifle. The image was devastating in its simplicity. There was Patty Hearst, the 19-year-old student from one of America's most famous families, standing alongside the people who had taken her. The country could now see something that had previously existed only as a confusing series of recordings and statements. Patty appeared to be participating in a crime. From that moment, the case changed permanently. The FBI was no longer searching only for a kidnapped heiress. It was searching for Patty Hearst and the members of the SLA as participants in a criminal investigation. The question of whether she was a victim, an accomplice, or both could no longer be postponed. The kidnapping that had begun with a knock at an apartment door had entered a new and far more troubling phase. Patty Hearst was no longer simply the girl who had disappeared. She had become the girl the cameras had captured with a rifle, and the meaning of that image would dominate the rest of her story. After Patty Hearst disappeared from her Berkeley apartment, the case quickly became more than a search for a missing 19-year-old. The Symbionese Liberation Army had carefully turned the kidnapping into a public campaign, and every new message from the organization seemed to deepen the mystery surrounding Patty's condition. For the Hearst family, the central fact remained painfully simple. Their daughter was being held by armed extremists. But for the public and investigators, a second question was beginning to emerge. What was happening to Patty while she was in captivity? The SLA had not chosen an ordinary hostage. Patty was the granddaughter of William Randolph Hearst, a member of one of America's most prominent and wealthy media families. Her family name gave the organization an enormous amount of publicity, and the group intended to use that attention for its own political purposes. Instead of demanding only a conventional financial ransom, the SLA issued demands that were designed to create a public confrontation with the Hearst family. The organization required the family to distribute a massive amount of food to poor people. The demand was both practical and symbolic. It placed the wealth of the Hearst family directly against the SLA's revolutionary message and allowed the organization to present itself as fighting on behalf of people it considered victims of the existing social and economic system. Every discussion of the demand kept the kidnapping in the news. Every television report repeated the name of the SLA. Every newspaper story reminded the public that Patty Hearst remained somewhere in the hands of the group. The organization had achieved something it had struggled to obtain before the kidnapping: national recognition. But publicity could not tell the Hearst family whether Patty was safe. They still did not know exactly what was happening to her. The FBI had opened a major investigation under the code name HERNAP. Investigators were attempting to identify the SLA members involved, locate their safe places, and find Patty before the situation became even more dangerous. Yet the investigation faced an unusual obstacle. The SLA wanted to remain hidden, but it also wanted to communicate. The organization deliberately released messages through the media, meaning that the investigators had to pay close attention to statements coming from the kidnappers while also recognizing that those statements were part of a political campaign. The first major change came when the SLA began releasing recordings involving Patty herself. The fact that she was alive was important, but the words attributed to her were even more significant. Instead of simply pleading for rescue or describing herself as a captive, Patty began to speak as though her relationship with the SLA had changed. She said that she had taken the organization's side. She adopted a new name, Tanya. That name marked a striking break from the identity she had possessed before the kidnapping. Patricia Campbell Hearst had been a 19-year-old student from a famous family. Tanya was the identity associated with a radical revolutionary organization that had kidnapped her. The transformation was difficult for the public to comprehend. On April 3, 1974, the SLA released a recording in which Patty stated that she had joined the organization. For the Hearst family, the recording created an emotional contradiction that could not easily be resolved. Their daughter had been taken from her home. Now she appeared to be saying that she had chosen to stand with the people who had taken her. If the recording represented Patty's genuine beliefs, then something extraordinary had happened during her captivity. If the words were the result of fear or coercion, then the statement was evidence of something equally disturbing: the extent to which a captive could be psychologically controlled. At this point, there was no easy way for outsiders to know which interpretation was correct. Patty later said that she had been abused, threatened, and psychologically manipulated while in the custody of the SLA. Her later account would become central to the legal argument surrounding her actions. But the public did not yet have the complete story. Instead, people had fragments: the kidnapping, the political demands, the recordings, and the new name Tanya. The fragments created an image of a young woman whose identity seemed to be changing in front of the country. The psychological question became unavoidable. What happens to a person who is removed from her ordinary environment and placed entirely under the control of people who threaten her? How does fear affect decision-making? How does isolation change a person's understanding of the world outside? And, perhaps most importantly, how can someone observing the situation from a distance distinguish between a genuine change of belief and behavior produced under coercion? These questions would later be debated in court, but they were already present in the public discussion surrounding Patty Hearst. The case would eventually become associated with the concept commonly known as Stockholm Syndrome. That term has often been used when discussing Patty's relationship with the SLA, but it cannot provide a complete explanation for everything that happened. Her circumstances involved physical captivity, threats, psychological pressure, and later participation in criminal activity. Reducing all of that to a single psychological label risks ignoring the complexity of the situation. At the same time, the fact that Patty was later seen participating in an armed robbery cannot simply erase the circumstances under which she first became involved with the SLA. This tension would remain at the center of the case. The SLA, meanwhile, continued using Patty as a symbol. Her presence gave the organization something it could not easily create on its own: a connection between its revolutionary message and one of America's most recognizable wealthy families. Patty's voice could be broadcast to the same public that the SLA wanted to influence. Her transformation from hostage to apparent supporter gave the organization an extraordinary propaganda tool. To the outside world, however, the transformation was deeply unsettling. The public had first been asked to sympathize with a kidnapped young woman. Now it was being asked to believe that the same young woman had voluntarily rejected her previous life and joined an armed revolutionary organization. The difference between those two images was enormous. The FBI therefore had to consider a possibility that made the investigation more complicated. If Patty was moving with the SLA willingly, then finding her would involve tracking a participant in the organization's activities. If she remained under coercion, then she was still a hostage, even if she appeared to cooperate with her captors. Investigators could not simply assume that every action she took represented complete freedom of choice. But neither could they automatically assume that every action was forced. The evidence would have to be examined over time. The answer became even more urgent when Patty appeared publicly in connection with a crime. On April 15, 1974, the SLA robbed a bank in San Francisco. Security cameras recorded the people involved, and among them was Patty Hearst. She was carrying a rifle and assisting the SLA during the robbery. For investigators and the public, this was the moment when the story crossed a new boundary. Until then, Patty's alleged allegiance to the SLA had existed primarily through recordings and statements. Now there was visual evidence of her physical presence during a criminal act. The image seemed to confirm the most frightening possibility: that the kidnapped heiress had become an active member of the group that had abducted her. Yet even the camera could not answer the question of what was happening inside her mind. A recording could capture words. A photograph could capture behavior. Neither could reveal whether those words and actions were freely chosen. This distinction would become one of the most important issues in the entire case. The bank robbery also changed the FBI's task. The Bureau was no longer simply searching for a missing woman. It was now searching for Patty Hearst in connection with a criminal investigation involving the SLA. The same person could simultaneously occupy two roles: someone who had been kidnapped and someone who appeared to participate in a crime. For the public, that contradiction was almost impossible to resolve. Some saw the image of Patty with a rifle and believed it demonstrated that she had joined the SLA willingly. Others saw a 19-year-old who had been abducted at gunpoint and wondered whether her actions could be understood without considering the circumstances of her captivity. Neither interpretation could be settled by the image alone. The truth would require time, investigation, and eventually a courtroom. But before Patty Hearst could ever stand before a jury, the FBI had to find her. The investigation would become a long pursuit involving the surviving members of the SLA, their hidden locations, their changing identities, and the increasingly famous woman who appeared to have become one of them. The voice of Tanya had changed the case. The image of Patty with a rifle would change it again. From that point forward, the question was no longer simply where the kidnappers had taken Patty Hearst. It was whether the woman they had taken still existed beneath the identity the SLA had given her, and whether the law would eventually treat her primarily as a victim, a participant, or both. By April 15, 1974, the Patty Hearst kidnapping had already become one of the most closely watched criminal stories in America. For more than 2 months, the public had known Patty as a 19-year-old woman taken from her Berkeley apartment by armed members of the Symbionese Liberation Army. The FBI was searching for her under the Hernap investigation, while the SLA continued to use the kidnapping to spread its political message. Then, on April 15th, the story changed in a way that would make the question of Patty's identity almost impossible to avoid. That day, members of the SLA carried out a bank robbery in San Francisco. The robbery itself was a criminal act, but what made it extraordinary was the person captured alongside the group. Security cameras recorded Patty Hearst. She was not hidden in the background as an obvious hostage. She appeared with the members of the SLA and was carrying a rifle. The images provided something the earlier recordings had not: a visual record of Patty physically present during a crime. Until then, much of the public's understanding of her situation had come through statements released by the SLA. Patty had said she was alive. She had adopted the name Tanya. She had stated that she had joined the organization. But a recording could still leave room for uncertainty. The person hearing Patty's voice could not see the circumstances surrounding the recording. The public could not know what had happened immediately before she spoke, what pressure might have been placed upon her, or what her captors had told her. The bank surveillance footage created a different kind of evidence. It showed Patty standing alongside the people who had kidnapped her while the robbery was taking place. The image was difficult to reconcile with the earlier picture of a helpless hostage. A young woman from one of America's most famous families had apparently become part of an armed revolutionary organization. For many Americans, this was the moment when the story moved from a kidnapping into something much more complicated. The question was no longer simply whether Patty Hearst was alive. It was whether she had become a participant in the activities of the people who had abducted her. The distinction mattered enormously. If Patty had been forced to participate, then the image could be understood as evidence of continued coercion. If she had freely chosen to participate, then the image could be interpreted as evidence that she had voluntarily joined the SLA and accepted its criminal activities. The problem was that a camera could record behavior, but it could not record the circumstances inside a person's mind. It could show a rifle in Patty's hands. It could show her beside SLA members. It could show that she was present during a bank robbery, but it could not answer why she was there. That question would become one of the defining issues of the entire case. Patty later said that during her captivity, she had been abused, threatened, and psychologically manipulated. Her later accounts suggested that the period between her kidnapping and her appearance in the bank robbery could not be understood simply as a period in which she had freely made ordinary choices. According to that account, she had been placed under intense control by the people who had taken her. The prosecution would eventually challenge this interpretation, arguing that Patty had made choices and had voluntarily participated in SLA activities. The opposing explanations created two dramatically different versions of the same events. In one version, Patty was a young woman trying to survive while trapped by an extremist organization. In the other, she had crossed a line from victim to willing participant. The bank robbery became the clearest public symbol of that conflict. It was also a major turning point for the FBI. Before April 15th, the Bureau's primary objective was to locate Patty Hearst and the people responsible for her kidnapping. She was the missing daughter of a prominent family, and the central goal was to find her. But after the robbery, investigators had to consider a more complicated situation. Patty was now connected, at least visibly, to a criminal act carried out by the SLA. She was no longer simply the person the FBI was trying to rescue. She had become part of the investigative picture surrounding the organization. Yet that did not erase the original circumstances of her disappearance. The FBI still knew that Patty had been taken by force from her apartment. She had not originally chosen to become a member of the SLA. That fact remained important even as her later actions appeared increasingly difficult to distinguish from those of the organization's other members. The contradiction was now visible to everyone. The same woman could be described accurately as someone who had been kidnapped and as someone who had appeared to participate in a bank robbery. Those two facts did not cancel each other out, but they created an extraordinarily difficult question about responsibility. The media quickly focused on the image of Patty carrying a rifle. It became one of the most recognizable images associated with the case. For the public, the rifle seemed to symbolize the transformation that had taken place. Before the kidnapping, Patty was a 19-year-old student. After the kidnapping, she was calling herself Tanya and appearing beside armed members of the SLA. The change was so dramatic that it encouraged people to search for a simple explanation. Some could look at the image and conclude that Patty had chosen her new identity. Others could look at the same image and remember that the woman holding the rifle had first been abducted at gunpoint. The difficulty was that both perspectives were based on real elements of the case. Patty's later statements about abuse and psychological manipulation could not erase the fact that she had participated visibly in the robbery. At the same time, the robbery could not erase the fact that her involvement with the SLA had begun with a kidnapping. The case therefore forced an uncomfortable distinction between behavior and freedom. A person can perform an action without outsiders knowing the full circumstances under which the action was performed. That distinction would become increasingly important as the investigation continued. The bank robbery also demonstrated how effectively the SLA had transformed Patty into a public symbol. The organization had begun with a relatively obscure political identity. By kidnapping a member of the Hearst family, it had gained national attention. By releasing Patty's statements under the name Tanya, it had presented her as an apparent convert to its cause. Now, by having her appear during a bank robbery, the organization had created an image that would be impossible for the public to forget. Patty was no longer only a hostage whose photograph appeared in reports about a kidnapping. She had become one of the most visible faces associated with the SLA. For investigators, this created another problem. The group remained underground, using hidden locations and different identities, while Patty was now recognizable across the country. Anyone who saw her could potentially provide information. But recognition did not necessarily make her easier to find. She was moving with the organization, and the SLA had demonstrated that it was capable of avoiding capture. The FBI therefore had to pursue the group while also trying to understand Patty's role within it. The investigation was becoming a search not only for people but for answers about relationships, loyalty, coercion, and responsibility. What had happened during Patty's captivity? How much influence did the SLA have over her? Was her adoption of the name Tanya a genuine expression of belief, an attempt to survive, or some combination of pressures and choices? The evidence available to the public could not settle those questions. The robbery had provided an image, but not an explanation. And there was another reason the image mattered so much. It changed the way Patty would eventually be viewed by the legal system. If she had remained only a kidnapping victim, the question of her conduct might never have arisen in the same way. But once she appeared in a bank robbery carrying a rifle, prosecutors had a concrete criminal act with which to associate her. The later trial would revolve around whether her participation should be understood as voluntary or the product of coercion. For now, however, Patty remained outside the reach of investigators. The FBI had to find her and the surviving members of the SLA before they could fully reconstruct what had happened. The search would continue for months. It would eventually lead investigators to a violent confrontation in Los Angeles, where the SLA would suffer a devastating loss. But Patty would not be there. She would escape once again, disappearing with other members of the organization and extending the mystery that had begun with her kidnapping. The bank robbery had therefore answered one question, but created several others. It proved that Patty was alive. It showed that she was physically with the SLA. It demonstrated that she had participated, at least visibly, in a serious criminal act. But it still could not tell America what Patty Hearst herself had experienced. The rifle could be seen, the kidnapping could be documented, the recordings could be heard. Yet the most important question remained hidden when Patty stood beside her captors on April 15, 1974. Was she acting as a willing member of the Symbionese Liberation Army, or was she still, in a very different form, a prisoner of the people who had taken her? That question would follow her long after the bank robbery ended, and the FBI's next task would be to find the organization responsible for creating the impossible situation in the first place. After the bank robbery on April 15, 1974, the investigation into Patty Hearst and the Symbionese Liberation Army entered a more dangerous phase. The FBI was no longer dealing with a kidnapping in which the location of a missing young woman was the central unknown. Patty had been seen with the SLA during the robbery, carrying a rifle and appearing to participate in the crime. The image was now part of the public record, and investigators had to pursue the organization while also determining Patty's role within it. The case had become a search for a group of armed fugitives and for a 19-year-old woman whose status remained deeply ambiguous. She had originally been taken from her Berkeley apartment by force, yet she was now traveling with the people who had kidnapped her. The FBI had to account for both realities. The SLA remained an underground organization. Its members could use different identities and hidden locations, making them difficult to locate. They were not operating openly, despite the enormous publicity surrounding Patty Hearst. The organization wanted its political message heard, but it also needed to protect its members from arrest. This created a difficult balance. The SLA could use the media to communicate with the country, while its members remained concealed from law enforcement. Investigators, therefore, had to build their case through fragments of information, following leads that might reveal where the organization was hiding. According to the information available about the investigation, thousands of leads were examined during the search. Each lead potentially offered a way to identify a member, locate a safe place, or determine where Patty and the other fugitives were moving. But the sheer number of leads also reflected the difficulty of the case. Patty Hearst had become one of the most recognizable missing persons in America, while the organization around her remained capable of disappearing from view. The investigation required patience and constant attention. The FBI was attempting to reconstruct the movements of a group that did not want to be found, while the public continued to watch for any sign of Patty. The question of her whereabouts was connected to the larger question of what had happened to her. If she was traveling voluntarily with the SLA, then finding her would mean locating a participant in the group's activities. If she remained under psychological control, then finding her was also an effort to recover a kidnapping victim. The two possibilities existed at the same time, and investigators could not simply erase either one. Meanwhile, the SLA's activities continued. The organization remained armed, and its members were willing to use violence. The danger became unmistakable in Los Angeles in May 1974. On May 16th, two members of the SLA attempted to steal a belt of ammunition from a store in Los Angeles. Police became aware of the vehicle associated with the group. The discovery provided investigators with a concrete lead, and that lead eventually brought them to a safe house connected with the SLA. For law enforcement, locating the safe house represented a major breakthrough. After months of searching, investigators had found a place where members of the organization were believed to be hiding. But finding the SLA did not mean the situation would end peacefully. The group was armed, and the confrontation that followed would become one of the most dramatic episodes in the entire case. On May 17th, police surrounded the house in Los Angeles. Members of the SLA were inside. What began as an attempt to capture the fugitives quickly developed into a violent armed confrontation. Gunfire erupted between the people inside and the police outside. The situation escalated as the standoff continued, and eventually the house caught fire. The fire transformed the confrontation into a catastrophe for the SLA. 6 members of the organization died in the blaze. Among those killed was Donald DeFries, the man known as Sink and one of the group's most prominent leaders. His death represented a devastating blow to the organization. The man who had been one of the central figures of the SLA was gone, along with 5 other members. For law enforcement, the confrontation represented a major breakthrough against the organization. But it did not bring the Patty Hearst case to an end. There was one crucial fact that immediately became clear. Patty Hearst was not inside the house. She had escaped with other members of the SLA before the police could capture her. The woman at the center of the national search remained free. The destruction of the safe house and the deaths of 6 SLA members therefore solved only part of the problem. The organization had lost its prominent leader, but Patty remained missing. Other members remained at large as well. The investigation continued. For the public, the events in Los Angeles added another layer to an already extraordinary story. The SLA had begun as a small radical organization seeking national attention. It had kidnapped Patty Hearst and used her family name to broadcast its political demands. Patty had later appeared in a bank robbery with the group. Now, one of the organization's most important leaders was dead after a violent confrontation with police, while Patty had once again escaped. The case was becoming less like a conventional kidnapping investigation and more like an extended manhunt involving a radical underground organization. Yet the central uncertainty surrounding Patty remained. Her physical presence with the SLA was undeniable. Her participation in the bank robbery had been captured on camera. But her reasons for remaining with the group could not be determined from those images alone. Patty later said that she had been abused, threatened, and psychologically manipulated during her captivity. That claim would eventually become a major part of her defense. The prosecution would later argue that she had made choices and voluntarily participated in the activities of the SLA. The Los Angeles confrontation did not resolve that question. If anything, it made the uncertainty more significant. The group that had held Patty was now dramatically weakened, but she still chose, or appeared to choose, to remain with its surviving members rather than immediately return to her family. To an outside observer, that behavior could be interpreted in many ways. It could appear to demonstrate loyalty to the SLA. It could be understood as evidence of psychological control, or it could reflect circumstances that were not visible to anyone outside the group. The facts alone did not provide a simple explanation. What was clear was that the FBI's search had entered a new stage. Patty and the surviving members of the SLA had escaped the Los Angeles confrontation, and investigators had to begin again. The organization had lost 6 members, including Donald DeFries, but its remaining members were still capable of hiding. Patty's status had become even more complicated because the public now knew that she had been physically present during a bank robbery and had subsequently remained with the organization. She was no longer simply the young woman whose family was pleading for her return. She was a wanted figure connected to the criminal activities of the SLA. The FBI therefore continued to investigate every available lead. The search extended beyond the immediate aftermath of the Los Angeles shootout. The surviving members needed places to hide, identities that could conceal them, and ways to avoid law enforcement. Patty, whose face was already known across the country, presented a particular challenge. Her visibility could make her easier to recognize, but the people around her could also help her remain hidden. The manhunt would continue for many more months. During that time, the case would remain fixed in the public imagination because of the contradiction at its center. Patty had been kidnapped. Patty had later joined the people who kidnapped her, at least according to her own public statements. Patty had participated in a bank robbery. Patty had escaped from the SLA safe house before the police confrontation. Each fact was documented within the broader case, but none of them alone answered the question of responsibility. The May 17th confrontation had destroyed one chapter of the SLA's story, but it had not ended Patty Hearst's. The FBI had captured the organization's location, but not its most famous captive. Donald DeFreeze was dead, but Patty was still somewhere beyond the reach of authorities. The search would therefore continue into the summer of 1974, through the remainder of that year, and into 1975. The longer Patty remained missing, the more the public story changed. She was no longer simply a kidnapped student. She had become a symbol of the strange and uncomfortable possibility that a victim could appear to become part of the group responsible for her captivity. Yet behind the headlines remained a basic human fact. Patty had been 19 years old when armed strangers entered her apartment and took her away. Whatever happened afterward would have to be understood in light of that beginning. The FBI could search for her, prosecutors could later argue about her choices, and the public could debate the meaning of the famous rifle image. But none of those later events could erase the moment when the original crime occurred. The investigation now had to find out where Patty had gone after Los Angeles. The surviving members of the SLA had disappeared again, and Patty had disappeared with them. The manhunt was not over. It was only entering its longest and most uncertain stage. After the violent confrontation in Los Angeles on May 17, 1974, the Symbionese Liberation Army was severely weakened, but the disappearance of Patty Hearst continued. 6 members of the organization had died in the burning safe house, including Donald DeFreeze, known as Sink, one of its most prominent leaders. Yet Patty was not among the dead. She had escaped with other surviving members before the police surrounded the house. The FBI had therefore achieved a major breakthrough without reaching the person whose disappearance had started the entire investigation. The manhunt continued, and Patty's position within it remained unusually difficult to define. She was still the 19-year-old woman who had originally been kidnapped from her Berkeley apartment. But she was also the woman who had appeared on security footage carrying a rifle during a bank robbery. She had called herself Tanya and publicly stated that she had joined the SLA. Now she was moving with surviving members of the same organization. To the outside world, the contradiction was becoming almost impossible to resolve. The months that followed would transform the kidnapping into a prolonged story of disappearance, pursuit, and uncertainty. The surviving members of the SLA needed to remain hidden. They had already demonstrated that they were prepared to use violence, and the confrontation in Los Angeles had shown them that law enforcement was closing in. Their organization had lost its most prominent leader, but the remaining members did not simply disappear from the investigation. The FBI continued to follow leads, examine information, and search for places where the fugitives might be hiding. Patty's presence made the investigation especially complicated. Her face was widely known. She had become one of the most recognizable people connected to the case. Yet recognition did not make her easy to find. The people around her could help her remain concealed, while the underground nature of the SLA allowed its surviving members to move between hidden locations. The FBI therefore had to search for both the surviving members of the organization and Patty herself. According to the information available about the case, thousands of leads were investigated during the broader manhunt. Each lead represented a possibility that Patty or another SLA member had been seen, identified, or connected to a particular location. But a lead was not the same thing as a solution. The investigation continued through uncertainty, with law enforcement attempting to reconstruct movements that had deliberately been kept hidden. For Patty's family, every passing month meant another period without knowing where she was or what condition she was in. The kidnapping had already transformed their lives. Now the uncertainty was prolonged by the fact that Patty appeared to be moving with the people who had taken her. Her public statements and the bank robbery made the family situation even more complicated. They were still the family of a kidnapped young woman, but their daughter was now also being investigated in connection with criminal activity. That contradiction would eventually have to be addressed in court. But before any trial could happen, investigators first had to locate her. The public continued to follow the case because Patty's story remained extraordinary. There was a clear beginning, a 19-year-old student taken from her apartment by armed kidnappers. There was a dramatic transformation, the same young woman later appearing as Tanya, claiming to have joined the SLA. There was the bank robbery, where she was seen carrying a rifle. There was the Los Angeles confrontation, where 6 SLA members died and Donald DeFreeze was killed. But after that confrontation came something much less visible: months of hiding. This part of the story did not have the dramatic clarity of the bank surveillance image or the violent confrontation in Los Angeles. It was a long period in which the central characters were largely outside public view. Yet those months mattered because they prolonged the central question. If Patty had been forced into cooperation with the SLA, why did she continue moving with its surviving members after the organization had suffered such a devastating defeat? If she had voluntarily joined the group, what did that say about the transformation that had taken place since her kidnapping? The answers could not be established simply by watching her from a distance. Patty later maintained that her time with the SLA had involved abuse, threats, and psychological manipulation. That account would become essential to her eventual defense. The prosecution, however, would argue that she had made choices and willingly participated in the organization's activities. The legal conflict was still in the future, but the evidence that would shape it was being created during these months. Patty's continued association with the SLA could be interpreted as evidence of loyalty, coercion, fear, psychological dependence, or a complicated combination of circumstances. The available facts did not allow a simple conclusion. The concept of Stockholm Syndrome was later associated with discussions of Patty Hearst, but the case itself was more complicated than that label suggested. It involved an actual kidnapping, a radical organization, threats and alleged psychological manipulation, criminal participation, and eventually a legal question about personal responsibility. The distinction between those elements would become critical. A person can be a victim of a crime and still commit another crime afterward. The existence of the first crime does not automatically answer whether the second act was voluntary. At the same time, participation in a criminal act cannot automatically prove that the person was completely free from coercion. The Patty Hearst case forced those two possibilities into direct conflict. The FBI continued its pursuit while Patty remained beyond its reach. The organization around her had changed dramatically since the kidnapping. Donald DeFreeze was dead. 6 SLA members had been killed in Los Angeles. The group was no longer the same organization that had first demanded food from the Hearst family. But the surviving members still had one of the most famous fugitives in America traveling with them. Patty's public identity had also changed. Before February 1974, she had been a student and member of the Hearst family. After the kidnapping, she became a missing person. After the recordings, she became Tanya. After the bank robbery, she became a wanted figure. After Los Angeles, she became part of a prolonged manhunt. Each stage added another layer to the question of who she was and what had happened to her. The longer the search continued, the more the original kidnapping seemed to become only the first chapter of a much larger story. But it remained the foundation of everything that followed. Patty had not initially sought the attention, the political identity, or the criminal role that the SLA eventually associated with her. She had been taken from her home. The debate was about what happened after that moment, and how much control she ultimately had over her actions. By 1975, the search had continued for roughly a year and a half. The FBI remained determined to locate Patty and the remaining members of the SLA. The investigation had already demonstrated that the organization could evade law enforcement despite its national notoriety. The surviving fugitives continued to use hidden locations and different identities, while investigators continued to pursue information that might lead them to the group. Then, after approximately 19 months of uncertainty, the search finally came to an end. On September 18, 1975, the FBI arrested Patty Hearst in San Francisco. The long disappearance was over, but the arrest did not resolve the central controversy. In fact, it transformed the question into a legal one. Patty was no longer simply missing. She was now a defendant. The government would have to determine what charges to bring and how to interpret her conduct during her time with the SLA. Patty's lawyers would eventually argue that her behavior had been shaped by the circumstances of her captivity. Prosecutors would argue that she had exercised her own judgment and voluntarily participated in criminal activities. The jury would ultimately have to decide whether the evidence supported criminal responsibility. But before that could happen, the public had to confront the strange reality of September 18, 1975. The young woman who had vanished from a Berkeley apartment 19 months earlier had finally been found. Yet she did not return to the public as the same person who had disappeared. She returned as someone whose name was associated with a bank robbery, an armed revolutionary organization, and one of the most controversial transformations in modern American criminal history. The FBI had found Patty Hearst, but the question that had followed her since the first recording remained unanswered. What had happened between the kidnapping and the bank robbery, and how much of what came afterward could truly be called a free choice? The answer would now move from the streets and safe houses into a courtroom. The next chapter would not be about finding Patty. It would be about deciding what she was responsible for. When the FBI arrested Patty Hearst in San Francisco on September 18, 1975, the 19-month search finally came to an end. But the arrest did not provide the simple conclusion that many people might have expected. Finding Patty did not answer the question that had surrounded her since the first recordings. Released by the Symbionese Liberation Army, it did not explain exactly what had happened to her during captivity, and it did not settle whether the woman who appeared carrying a rifle during the San Francisco bank robbery should be regarded primarily as a victim, a willing participant, or something more complicated. Instead, the case moved into its next stage. Patty Hearst was no longer simply a kidnapped young woman whose whereabouts were unknown. She was now a criminal defendant, and the events that had taken place after her kidnapping would have to be examined through the legal system. The transformation was extraordinary. In February 1974, Patty had been taken from her Berkeley apartment by armed members of the SLA. 19 months later, she was in federal custody, facing the consequences of action she had taken while associated with the organization. The central question was no longer only what the SLA had done to Patty. It was what Patty herself was responsible for doing afterward. The prosecution and the defense would offer sharply different interpretations of the same period. Patty's defense centered on the circumstances of her captivity. She later said that she had been abused, threatened, and psychologically manipulated by the SLA. Her lawyers argued that her conduct while with the organization could not be separated from those circumstances. She had not entered the SLA under ordinary conditions. She had been kidnapped, isolated, and placed under the control of armed extremists. According to the defense, that history mattered when determining whether her later actions represented genuine freedom of choice. The argument did not require anyone to deny that Patty had appeared during a bank robbery or that she had been seen carrying a rifle. Those facts were part of the case. Instead, the defense sought to explain why those actions should not automatically be interpreted as proof of voluntary participation. The prosecution offered a fundamentally different interpretation. Prosecutors argued that Patty had made choices and had voluntarily participated in the activities of the SLA. From this perspective, the fact that she had initially been kidnapped did not automatically remove her responsibility for later conduct. The government had to persuade the jury that Patty's participation could be treated as criminal behavior for which she was legally responsible. The conflict, therefore, went beyond the question of whether Patty had committed a particular act. The deeper issue was the degree of freedom she possessed when she committed it. That distinction made the case unusually difficult. The public could see the famous image of Patty carrying a rifle. They could hear the recordings in which she called herself Tanya and declared that she had joined the SLA. They knew that she had remained with the organization after the kidnapping. But none of those pieces of evidence could, by themselves, reveal the complete psychological circumstances surrounding her decisions. A camera could show what Patty did. A recording could preserve what she said. Neither could provide a complete answer to why she behaved that way. The defense, therefore, placed significant emphasis on the experience of captivity itself. Patty's account described a period in which she had been subjected to abuse, threats, and psychological manipulation. The idea commonly known as Stockholm Syndrome was also associated with discussions of the case. But the circumstances were more complicated than a single psychological label. The case involved a real kidnapping, an armed extremist organization, political pressure, psychological control, and later participation in criminal activity. The legal system had to consider those elements without turning them into an overly simple story. The jury ultimately rejected the defense argument at the level necessary to excuse Patty from criminal responsibility. Patty Hearst was convicted in connection with the bank robbery and sentenced to 7 years in prison. The verdict represented a significant moment because it established a legal judgment about responsibility, even though it did not end the public debate about what had happened to Patty. Legally, she had been found responsible for her conduct. But outside the courtroom, the central question remained. Could someone who had first been abducted by armed extremists later be held fully responsible for actions committed while living under their influence? The verdict did not make that question disappear. It simply provided the legal answer in Patty's particular case. The sentence was 7 years, but Patty would not spend the full 7 years in prison. Her punishment was later reduced, and she was released after serving approximately 2 years. In 1979, President Jimmy Carter reduced her sentence. The reduction was significant because it marked a later recognition of the circumstances surrounding her case, even though the original conviction remained an important part of the legal history. Patty's release meant that the story could continue beyond the courtroom. She was no longer a prisoner, but she also could not simply return to the life she had lived before February 1974. Her name had become permanently associated with the SLA, the bank robbery, the famous surveillance image, and the extraordinary question of whether a kidnapping victim could become responsible for crimes committed during captivity. The legal story eventually received another major development decades later. In 2001, President Bill Clinton granted Patty Hearst a full pardon. By then, the original kidnapping was almost 3 decades in the past. The organization responsible for taking her had largely disappeared, and the events of 1974 had become part of American criminal history. Yet the pardon provided a final legal chapter to a case that had never stopped provoking debate. The SLA itself had not survived in its original form. The death of Donald DeFreeze and 5 other members during the Los Angeles confrontation had severely damaged the organization. But the investigation into its surviving members continued long after Patty Hearst was arrested. According to the information available in the case, 2 of the last SLA members were eventually captured in 1999 and 2002. Their arrests demonstrated just how long the shadow of the organization continued to extend. The kidnapping had begun with a small radical group seeking recognition. It ended as a case remembered decades later because of the unusual path taken by its most famous victim. Patty Hearst's story is difficult precisely because it resists a clean division between innocence and guilt. The beginning is straightforward. On February 4th, 1974, armed people entered her apartment. She was taken against her will and placed in a vehicle. She became a hostage. Nothing about that beginning suggests voluntary participation, but the events that followed are more difficult to categorize. Patty adopted the name Tanya. She publicly declared that she had joined the SLA. She appeared during a bank robbery carrying a rifle. She remained with members of the organization during the long period when they were being pursued by the FBI. Those actions were real, and the legal system ultimately held her responsible for her participation in the bank robbery. Yet the circumstances surrounding those actions also mattered. Patty maintained that she had been threatened, abused, and psychologically manipulated. That claim does not erase the actions captured on camera, but neither can those images erase the kidnapping that came first. This is why the Patty Hearst case remains so unsettling. It asks the listener to hold two uncomfortable facts in mind at the same time. A person can be victimized and later become involved in wrongdoing. A person can appear to make a choice while operating under circumstances that profoundly restrict freedom. The difficult task is determining where coercion ends and responsibility begins. The case also demonstrates the limitations of judging a person's internal state from outward behavior alone. When Patty was seen carrying a rifle, the image was powerful because it appeared to communicate everything. It showed a young woman standing with armed revolutionaries. But it could not show fear, pressure, manipulation, or private uncertainty. When Patty's recorded voice announced that she was Tanya, listeners could hear the words, but could not see everything surrounding the moment in which they were spoken. The public was therefore left to interpret incomplete evidence, while the courtroom eventually had to reach a legal conclusion. In the end, Patty Hearst was convicted, sentenced to 7 years, released after approximately 2 years following the reduction of her sentence, and ultimately pardoned by President Clinton in 2001. But the legal conclusion did not eliminate the historical question. Perhaps that is why the case has remained so memorable. It began as the story of a 19-year-old woman taken from her home and became a national debate about identity, coercion, political extremism, and responsibility. The image of Patty with a rifle remains one of the most recognizable symbols of that transformation, but it should never be allowed to erase the image that came before it. A young woman whose life changed when armed kidnappers entered her apartment on February 4, 1974. Between those two images lies the heart of the case. The first tells us that Patty was a victim of kidnapping. The second tells us that she later participated in a criminal act. The law ultimately assigned responsibility for that act. But history continues to ask a more complicated question. What happened to the person between those two moments? Perhaps there is no single answer that can completely resolve it. Patty Hearst was neither a simple character in a story of innocent victimhood, nor an easy example of a willing criminal conversion. Her experience existed in the difficult space between captivity and choice. That is what makes the case endure. The SLA wanted to turn a kidnapping into a political spectacle. Instead, it created a story that forced America to confront something much harder: the possibility that a victim's behavior can change under extreme circumstances, and that the line between victim and offender is not always as clear as a photograph might make it appear. In the end, the most enduring question is not simply whether Patty Hearst was guilty or innocent. The courtroom answered the legal question. The deeper question remains human. At what point does a person who has been taken against her will become responsible for what she does while trying to survive? Nearly everything about the Patty Hearst case can be traced back to that question, from the knock on the apartment door to the rifle in the bank, from the 19-month manhunt to the courtroom, and finally to the pardon decades later. The kidnapping ended long before the debate did. And perhaps that is why Patty Hearst remains one of the most difficult figures in the history of American true crime. Not because the facts are impossible to know, but because the meaning of those facts is far more difficult to settle. The arrest of Patty Hearst on September 18, 1975, brought an end to one of the longest, and most unusual chapters of the investigation. But it did not bring an end to the questions created by her kidnapping. For approximately 19 months, the FBI had searched for Patty and the surviving members of the Symbionese Liberation Army. During that period, the case had changed repeatedly. It began with the abduction of a 19-year-old student from a Berkeley apartment. It became a national political spectacle when the SLA demanded that the Hearst family distribute food to poor people. It became even more confusing when Patty appeared in recordings using the name Tanya and declaring that she had joined the organization. Then came the bank robbery in San Francisco, where security cameras captured Patty carrying a rifle alongside SLA members. The violent confrontation in Los Angeles followed, killing 6 members of the group, including Donald DeFries. Yet Patty escaped and remained hidden. Finally, in September 1975, the FBI found her in San Francisco. At that moment, one chapter ended and another began. Patty was no longer a missing person. She was now a defendant whose actions would be examined in court. The legal process forced the country to confront a question that had been debated since the first photographs and recordings appeared. How should the actions of a kidnapping victim be judged when that victim later appears to participate in criminal activity with her captors? The answer could not be found simply by looking at Patty's famous image with a rifle. The image showed what she was doing, but it did not reveal what had happened to her psychologically during the months between her abduction and the robbery. Patty later said that she had been abused, threatened, and psychologically manipulated by the SLA. Her defense therefore focused on the circumstances of her captivity. The argument was that her conduct could not be separated from the environment in which she had been held. She had not entered the organization freely. Her relationship with the SLA had begun with an armed kidnapping, and the defense argued that this fact remained fundamental to understanding her subsequent behavior. The prosecution presented the issue differently. From its perspective, Patty had eventually made choices and participated in the organization's criminal activities. Her presence during the bank robbery and her conduct while associated with the SLA were therefore treated as evidence of responsibility rather than merely evidence of continued victimization. The jury ultimately rejected the defense at the level necessary to excuse her from criminal responsibility. Patty was convicted in connection with the bank robbery and sentenced to 7 years in prison. The verdict provided a legal conclusion, but it did not end the larger debate. Outside the courtroom, people continued to ask whether a person who had been kidnapped could truly be expected to behave normally while living under the control of an extremist organization. The case became closely associated with the concept commonly called Stockholm Syndrome. But even that term was insufficient to explain the entire situation. Patty's experience involved more than an emotional attachment to captors. It involved an actual kidnapping, alleged abuse and threats, psychological manipulation, political indoctrination, isolation, and participation in criminal activity. Treating the case as a simple example of Stockholm Syndrome would overlook the many separate circumstances that shaped it. The legal outcome also did not erase the original crime committed against Patty. She had been taken from her home by armed people. That fact remained true regardless of what she later did. At the same time, the original kidnapping did not automatically make every later action legally excusable. This was precisely the difficult boundary the trial had been required to examine. Patty's story, therefore, became an unusual example of how victimhood and criminal responsibility can exist within the same case. The person who was victimized at the beginning could later become involved in conduct for which the legal system held her responsible. That does not mean the first crime caused the second in any simple or automatic way. Nor does the later criminal conviction erase the circumstances of the kidnapping. Both parts of the story have to be acknowledged. Patty did not remain in prison for the entire 7-year sentence. After approximately 2 years, her sentence was reduced and she was released. In 1979, President Jimmy Carter reduced her sentence. The reduction gave the case another important legal development. because Patty was no longer serving the punishment originally imposed by the court. Her release, however, did not make the public controversy disappear. The Patty Hearst name remained inseparable from the events of 1974 and 1975. The case had already entered American cultural memory as an extraordinary story of transformation. A young woman from an exceptionally wealthy and influential family had been taken by a radical organization and then appeared to adopt its identity. She had gone from hostage to apparent participant. The story challenged the expectation that victims always behave in ways that are easily recognizable as resistance. Patty's behavior did not fit that expectation, and that was part of what made the case so difficult for the public to understand. The case also left a lasting impression on the way people discuss psychological coercion. Patty's experience raised questions about how captivity can affect decision-making and identity. It encouraged public discussion about the possibility that a person's outward behavior may not always reveal the internal pressures shaping that behavior. Yet the case also demonstrated why such explanations must be treated carefully. Psychological labels cannot replace the facts. They cannot tell us automatically why a person behaved in a particular way, and they cannot by themselves determine legal responsibility. In Patty's case, the jury had to consider the evidence and ultimately found that her conduct warranted a criminal conviction. The story of the SLA itself continued after Patty's arrest. The death of Donald DeFries and 5 other members during the Los Angeles confrontation had severely weakened the organization. But the surviving members did not disappear from the attention of law enforcement. The FBI continued pursuing them. The investigation therefore extended far beyond the moment when Patty was found. According to the information available in the case, 2 of the last SLA members were eventually captured in 1999 and 2002. Those arrests demonstrated the extraordinary length of the investigation's shadow. The kidnapping had occurred in 1974. Patty had been arrested in 1975. And yet the search for members of the organization continued for decades. The case had outlived the period in which the SLA dominated national headlines. Its political ambitions had faded, its prominent leader was dead, and many of its members had disappeared, but law enforcement continued to pursue those who remained. Patty's own legal story eventually reached its final major chapter in 2001, when President Bill Clinton granted her a full pardon. By then, nearly 3 decades had passed since her kidnapping. The pardon did not change the fact that she had been convicted, but it became the final major legal development in her case. The young woman who had once been taken from a Berkeley apartment was now a historical figure whose name had become permanently linked to questions of captivity, coercion, criminal responsibility, and political extremism. Looking back, the Patty Hearst case is difficult to understand without recognizing how quickly the roles changed. At first, Patty was the victim and the SLA was the perpetrator. Then Patty appeared to become a member of the organization. The public saw her carrying a rifle. Investigators pursued her, as well as the people who had kidnapped her. Later, the courts examined her actions and held her criminally responsible. Finally, years after her release, she received a presidential pardon. Each stage added another interpretation without completely eliminating the previous one. The case therefore resists the simple categories often used in crime stories. It is not merely a kidnapping story. It is not merely a bank robbery story. It is not merely the story of a radical organization. It is the story of what happened when all 3 collided around one 19-year-old woman. The most enduring image remains Patty holding a rifle during the bank robbery, because that image appears to capture the entire mystery in a single frame. But the image tells only part of the story. Before the rifle came the kidnapping. Before the name Tanya came Patricia Campbell Hearst, a student living in Berkeley. Before the criminal charges came a 19-month period of uncertainty in which her family did not know what would happen to her. And behind all of it was the question that could never be completely answered by photographs, recordings, or even a courtroom verdict. How much freedom did Patty Hearst possess after armed strangers had taken control of her life? the law eventually provided its judgment. The jury convicted her. She received a 7-year sentence. President Carter reduced that sentence, and President Clinton later granted a full pardon. But legal decisions and historical interpretation are not always the same thing. The law determined responsibility for the conduct charged. History continues to examine the circumstances that produced that conduct. That distinction is what gives the case its lasting power. Patty Hearst's story remains unsettling because it forces us to recognize that victimhood does not always look the way people expect, and that human behavior under extreme pressure can be difficult to interpret from the outside. The case also reminds us that a single photograph can never contain an entire human experience. The rifle was real. The bank robbery was real. The kidnapping was real. The threats and psychological manipulation Patty later described were part of her account. The conviction was real. The pardon was real. None of these facts cancels the others. Together, they form a story in which the boundaries between victim and offender became extraordinarily blurred. That is ultimately why the Patty Hearst kidnapping remains one of the most controversial criminal cases of 20th century America. It began as an attempt by a small extremist organization to gain attention by taking the granddaughter of a powerful media family. Instead, it produced a case that forced the public to debate the meaning of coercion, the limits of personal responsibility, and the psychological consequences of captivity. The SLA wanted to control Patty's image and use her as a political symbol. Decades later, however, the enduring significance of the case is not the political message the organization wanted America to remember. It is the unresolved human question at the center of Patty's transformation. When a person is taken against her will, where does captivity end? And where does responsibility begin? That question has no simple answer, and perhaps that is the most important legacy of the case. The story of Patty Hearst began on February 4, 1974. When armed members of the Symbionese Liberation Army entered her Berkeley apartment and took her away. It ended, in its legal sense, years later with a presidential pardon. But between those 2 points was a sequence of events so unusual that it challenged some of the simplest assumptions about crime, captivity, and responsibility. Patty was 19 when she was kidnapped. She was a student, a member of the wealthy and influential Hearst family, and someone whose life had previously existed far from the underground world of political violence represented by the SLA. Within months, she would become internationally known not only as a kidnapping victim, but as the young woman photographed carrying a rifle during a bank robbery alongside the people who had abducted her. That transformation remains the central mystery of the case. It is also the reason the story has survived long after the SLA itself disappeared. To understand the final meaning of the case, it is necessary to return to its beginning. The kidnapping was not a conventional ransom crime. The SLA had deliberately selected Patty because of the significance of her family. The organization wanted publicity, and it wanted to force the Hearst family into a public response to its political demands. The demand that the family distribute food to poor people transformed the kidnapping into a national political spectacle. Patty's captivity became a platform for the organization to announce its existence and its ideology. The strategy worked. Americans who had never heard of the SLA now knew its name. But the organization's greatest propaganda success came when Patty herself appeared to speak on its behalf. On April 3, 1974, she declared that she had joined the SLA and adopted the name Tanya. That statement changed the way the country viewed her. She was no longer simply the missing daughter of a prominent family. Her own voice appeared to be telling the public that she had chosen a new identity. Yet that declaration could not be separated from the fact that she had been kidnapped. She was speaking while in the custody of the people who had taken her. That contradiction became even more powerful on April 15th, when she appeared during the San Francisco bank robbery carrying a rifle. The image was unforgettable because it seemed to show an apparent transformation in physical form. The kidnapped teenager had become an armed participant in a criminal act. But the photograph could not show the circumstances behind the behavior. It could not reveal what Patty feared, what she had been told, what she believed, or how much control she believed she had over her own life. That limitation became the central problem of the case. The prosecution could point to actions. The defense could point to the conditions under which those actions occurred. Both were dealing with the same woman and the same events, but they interpreted them differently. The FBI's long pursuit added another layer to the story. After the bank robbery, investigators had to search not only for the surviving members of the SLA, but also for Patty. The organization used hidden locations and different identities, and thousands of leads were examined during the investigation. Then, on May 17, 1974, police surrounded an SLA safe house in Los Angeles. The confrontation ended with the house burning and 6 SLA members dead, including Donald DeFreeze. Yet Patty was not there. She had escaped with other members before the police surrounded the location. That escape extended the manhunt and deepened the mystery. If Patty had been kidnapped, why was she still moving with the organization after such a devastating confrontation? If she had voluntarily joined the group, what had caused such a dramatic transformation in the first place? The case offered no easy answer. For approximately 19 months after the kidnapping, Patty remained out of the reach of investigators. During that time, the distinction between hostage and fugitive became increasingly blurred in the eyes of the public. Her original status as a kidnapping victim remained an undeniable fact. But her later conduct had created a second identity in the public imagination. She was now also associated with an armed revolutionary organization and a bank robbery. On September 18, 1975, the FBI finally arrested her in San Francisco. The search was over, but the argument about her behavior was only beginning. Her trial transformed the questions of the previous 19 months into a legal dispute over responsibility. Patty's defense argued that she had been abused, threatened, and psychologically manipulated during captivity. The prosecution argued that she had made choices and voluntarily participated in the SLA's activities. The jury ultimately found her criminally responsible in connection with the bank robbery. She was sentenced to 7 years in prison. The verdict settled the legal question in the sense that the jury rejected the defense to the extent necessary to excuse her conduct. But it did not settle the historical question. The historical question was more difficult because it involved the nature of human behavior under captivity. How much freedom can a person exercise after being abducted and placed under the control of armed extremists? Can a person understand herself differently after prolonged psychological pressure? Can an action look voluntary from the outside while being shaped by fear or coercion? These are not questions that can be answered by a single photograph or a single statement. They require attention to the entire sequence of events. Patty's case became associated with the term Stockholm Syndrome, but that label should not be treated as a complete explanation. The circumstances were more complicated. Patty was not merely a person who developed an emotional attachment to captors. She was a kidnapping victim who later became involved in political and criminal activities under circumstances she described as abusive and coercive. The legal system had to distinguish between the fact of captivity and the responsibility for later conduct. The jury reached its decision based on the evidence presented at trial. History, however, continued to examine the psychological and human dimensions of the case. Patty did not serve the full 7-year sentence. In 1979, President Jimmy Carter reduced her sentence, and she was released after approximately 2 years. The reduction did not erase the conviction, but it marked an important change in the legal consequences of the case. More than 2 decades later, another president took an even more definitive step. In 2001, President Bill Clinton granted Patty Hearst a full pardon. By that time, the events of 1974 and 1975 belonged to another era. The SLA had largely disappeared, and the original kidnapping had become a historical case rather than an active national crisis. Yet the pardon gave the story a final legal chapter. It did not change what had happened, but it became part of the permanent record of how the United States eventually dealt with Patty Hearst's conviction. The SLA itself continued to cast a long shadow after Patty's arrest. The organization had been severely damaged by the deaths of its members in Los Angeles. But the investigation into the remaining fugitives continued. According to the available information, 2 members of the SLA were eventually captured in 1999 and 2002. Their arrests demonstrated that the consequences of the original kidnapping and the organization's violent activities continued for decades. The case, therefore, had an unusually long timeline. The kidnapping occurred in 1974. Patty was found in 1975. Her sentence was reduced in 1979. Her conviction was ultimately followed by a presidential pardon in 2001. And members of the organization connected to the case continued to be captured decades after the kidnapping itself. The long duration of the story is one reason it remains such a powerful example of 20th century American true crime. But perhaps the most important legacy of the case is not the chronology. It is the problem of interpretation. Patty Hearst's story does not fit neatly into the familiar categories of victim and perpetrator. She was unquestionably a victim of kidnapping at the beginning. She was later convicted of criminal conduct. Both statements are true. The existence of one does not automatically invalidate the other. This is precisely why the case remains so uncomfortable. It asks us to consider whether someone can remain a victim while also becoming responsible for a crime, and whether responsibility can be understood without examining the pressures that shaped the person's behavior. The answer cannot be found simply by deciding whether Patty was good or bad. Those categories are too simple for the circumstances. The SLA committed the original kidnapping. It created the conditions under which Patty's identity and behavior changed. Patty's later conduct was nevertheless serious enough that a jury convicted her. The legal system therefore recognized her responsibility, while the broader historical record continued to preserve the circumstances of her captivity. The case also offers a warning about the power of images. The photograph of Patty carrying a rifle became an immediate symbol of the entire story. But an image freezes only one moment. It cannot show the events that came before it or the psychological pressure surrounding it. The same is true of the recording in which Patty called herself Tanya. Her words were real, but the recording could not reveal everything happening outside the frame. Understanding the case requires resisting the temptation to let one dramatic image replace the entire history. The full story begins with a kidnapping, continues through political demands, captivity, public statements, a bank robbery, a violent confrontation, a 19-month manhunt, a criminal trial, imprisonment, release, and finally a presidential pardon. When those events are considered together, the case becomes less mysterious in one sense, but more complicated in another. We can know what happened without being able to fully know what Patty experienced internally. That distinction is important. True crime often encourages audiences to search for a definitive explanation, a single motive, or a clear dividing line between innocence and guilt. The Patty Hearst case resists that instinct. It shows that human behavior can exist within contradictory circumstances. It shows that a person can be harmed and later participate in harmful conduct. It shows that legal responsibility and psychological understanding are related but not identical. Questions. And it shows why the circumstances surrounding a crime matter, even when the outcome of a trial is clear. Nearly 50 years after the kidnapping, the most enduring question remains the same one that emerged when the first recording was released. What happened to Patty Hearst during those months of captivity that transformed her from Patricia Hearst into Tanya? The historical record provides many facts, but no single explanation can completely resolve the question. We know she was kidnapped. We know she later claimed to have joined the SLA. We know she participated in the bank robbery. We know she was pursued by the FBI, arrested, convicted, imprisoned, released, and eventually pardoned. We also know that she described her captivity as a period of abuse, threats, and psychological manipulation. These facts must be held together rather than selectively choosing one and ignoring the others. That may be the most honest way to remember the case. The story of Patty Hearst is not simply a story about a wealthy heiress, a radical organization, or a famous bank robbery. It is a story about what can happen when an ordinary life is violently interrupted and a person is forced into circumstances almost impossible for an outsider to understand. It is a story about power, fear, identity, and responsibility. And above all, it is a reminder that the line between victim and offender can become painfully complicated when a crime does not end with the initial act of violence. The SLA wanted to turn Patty Hearst into a symbol of its revolution. Instead, her story became a symbol of something much larger: the difficulty of understanding human choice under extreme pressure. The final legal chapter came with the presidential pardon in 2001, but the historical debate did not end there. Perhaps it never will. Because behind every headline, every photograph, every courtroom argument, and every FBI file was a 19-year-old woman whose life changed forever on one February night in Berkeley. The most important fact is also the simplest: Patty Hearst did not choose to be kidnapped. Everything that followed must be understood in the shadow of that beginning.